Alright, it's time to create an entity class. This class is going to be used to represent players, enemies, items, and whatever else. So in the project asset script folder, we're going to create an entity script. Open it up. First up, remove the unnecessary imports, followed by the update method. Next, we're going to add in a private boolean for isSentient, along with its getter. The reason being, this is to indicate if something is alive or not. We're then going to add in two conditions. These conditions first check if it is the player or not. Otherwise, it checks if it's sentient. These conditions will be handling the placement of our entities, whether or not it's going to be placed at the start or added onto the entity list. After the start method, we're going to implement a move method, where the move parameter will take in a direction, and with that direction, it will tell the game object what position it's going to be in. From here, we're going to create an action class and do the following. Import using Unity Engine, static public class action, followed by implementing three methods. A static public void escape action, a static public void movement action, taking in entity and direction, and a static public void skip action. The actions are quite simple. One simply prints a log saying quit in the console. The movement action uses entity.move method, taking in the direction given to it, followed by ending the turn of the GameManager. And finally, for the skip action, it simply just ends the turn. Now head on over to the GameManager. Here we're going to add an integer called entity_num, followed by a list with type entity, and giving it a variable name of entities, and initializing. We're going to next rename start to start turn, remove the instantiation, and add the following conditions. If entities with entity num get component player, then isPlayer turn equals true. This signifies that the turn is now the player's. Else if entities entity num is sentient, this will call the skip action as we don't have AI logic yet. Now heading down to the endTurn method, we're going to exchange its codes with a set of conditions. Once again checking if the entity's entity num is the player, it's going to set isPlayerTurn to false. It will then check to see if entity num equals entities.count -1, changing it to 0. Else, it will simply just increment it before starting a coroutine called turn delay, which is simply the wait for turns method just renamed. Remove the isPlayerTurn equals true from turn delay before adding the start turn method. This is followed by adding two simple methods that you've actually seen earlier within the entity class. Those two being add entity and insert entity. These are relatively simple. Add entity is simply adding an entity to the entities list, and insert entity is just adding the entity wherever we specify the index. In this case, it's going to be 0, as with our code, we always want the player to start first. I'm just going to quickly repurpose our player prefab. So heading over to the resources folder, drag player back into the hierarchy, right click it, go to prefab, and unpack it completely, followed by renaming it to NPC. Next, get rid of the player component script within it, and add the entity script, making sure the check is sentient, and change the color to yellow within the sprite renderer, before dragging it into the resources folder. Now left click player, and adding the entity script also to the player prefab. Once again, checking is sentient. And then get rid of the NPC game object within the hierarchy. While we're still at the hierarchy, right click and create a tile map. Rename it to floor map. Control C and Control V to duplicate it, before renaming the duplicated tile map to obstacle map. Heading over to grid and renaming it to MapManager. From here, click on Window within the top menu, going down to 2D, and selecting Tile Palette. Here we're going to create a new palette called Traditional Roguelike, before selecting Curate. Create a folder called Palette, and clicking Select Folder. Now from the sprite sheet, we're going to get the hash symbol and the full stop, dragging them into the tile palette. Selecting palette, and select folder. This process creates two tiles for us to use, as we can see within the palette folder. Now head on to the scripts folder, where we're going to create a script called MapManager. Now we're simply going to drag it onto the MapManager game object within the hierarchy before opening it up. As always, remove the unnecessary imports and the update method. Now I'm going to change the flow up a little bit and do the following. Now I'm going to add in an instance for the MapManager, followed by two private int variables that control both the width and height of the map. Two color variables. These will have a purpose later on. And then our two created tiles, followed by the tile maps that we created, and giving access to them with their own getter methods. Now import unity.tilemaps to get rid of the squiggly lines, before, just like the GameManager, creating an awake method that controls the instance. Now in the start method, I'm just going to add in a little bit of code. Now it is a little bit to take in, so I'll explain it step by step. We're getting a vector 3 center tile from halving both the width and height of the map. We're creating a box with the bounds int wall bounds, telling it it's going to start from the 29th X position and the 28th Y position. It's going to continue right 3 tiles before stopping. I've then added 2 simple for loops that will set every single tile within wall bounds to the wall tile. And then, like in the GameManager, I'll be instantiating both the player and the NPC prefabs. You can ignore camera.main.transform.position and camera.main.orthographic size, as it's just something I've done that's just a little bit of a sweet spot for viewing our roguelike. And before finishing off the MapManager, we're going to add in a Boolean method called inbounds that we'll be using to stop the player from leaving the game map. Heading back into the Unity editor, close the tile palette, before selecting the MapManager. Heading over to Inspector, we're going to set the tiles and the maps. With our MapManager now set up, we're going to open the player script. Now I was informed on a Reddit post that I should make a simpler way of using the input system, that way being using set callbacks. And to implement it, we're going to do the following. Adding controls.iPlayerActions after mono behavior. From here, we're going to get rid of our movement and exit subscriptions, followed by tweaking on movement and on exit. Within these methods, it's basically the same as before, with on movement still having the same conditions. But now our on exit method uses a condition that checks if escape has been pressed, followed by calling the escape action within our action class. Speaking of our action class, we're going to go ahead and change around the move player method. Like before, we'll be taking in the read value for the vector 2 from the movement, but now it's also going to round the direction. This is due to the fact that when the player will go diagonal, it would actually be 0.71, which is not the intended outcome. So by rounding the number, it goes to the nearest 1. We then create a future position using the transform.position plus our rounded direction, and then calling the isValidPosition. This is a method that takes in the future position, uses our floor map to convert it to world cell, which is a vector 3 int. We use this vector 3 int to do the following. We first check if it's not in bounds for the MapManager, using the MapManager inbounds method, followed by checking if the obstacle map has a tile on that position. We're also checking if the future position is also the current transform position. If any of these conditions are met, it will return false, stating that no, it is not a valid position. Otherwise, it returns true. If it does return true, then the action.movement action is called, passing in the game object, which is the player, and also the rounded direction. Once again, heading back to the Unity editor, we're going to go back into the resources folder and select both the NPC and player prefabs before changing their order and layer to 1. Now testing what we've done. Everything seems to be in order. And with that, comment below if you have any questions. Like and subscribe if you wish. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.